And speaking on Part 3 of the State Sector Management Bill, and would endorse wholeheartedly the comments that have been made by Grant Robertson and Steve Chadwick in relationship to the importance of archives and our concern about what this legislation will do to the independence and to the robustness of our information keeping service. And many of the same concerns would have applied and did apply to the discussion around the National Library. The independence and the ability to maintain records that people can then analyse and consider our history, to reflect critically on what was or wasn't done, and to really look at, for example, how we are governed, is a fundamental right and a fundamental necessity in a democracy. And so we are very concerned about this. So while, as others have said, there is provision in the bill in the clause around the Chief Archivist to act independently, clause 12, we do not believe that goes, 41, we do not believe that goes far enough, that has been constrained to acting independently and exercising his or her professional judgment. And as an employee and as a third-tier manager, we are not confident that independence is maintained. The people who work in places like the archives and in the National Library are professional people who are absolutely committed to what they do. And we know here, in dealing with the Parliamentary Library, just how committed people who work in this kind of role are to doing the job properly, to ensuring that they act in a way that is open and transparent. And so that equally applies to those working in Archives New Zealand. And those people do that work because they are passionate about maintaining the record and having that record accessible to people in New Zealand. So the reality is that reducing the independence of the chief archivist will have flow-on effects to everybody who works in the area of archives. And I would like the Minister to actually respond to some of the concerns that the side of the House is making. My colleague Moana Mackie talked in the previous part around the provisions of transfer of employees for the National Library and compared that to the provisions that are in Part 1 around transfer provisions for those working in Forced and Morst. Well, I want to make similar comments in relation to the transfer of employees of the National Archives, because effectively what is written here is very limited, and we want to have some confidence that the provision which is outlined in clause 59, transfer of Archives New Zealand employees to department, we want to be confident that those provisions actually do cover all of the areas that were covered under the provisions relating to the transfer of Forced and Morst staff, which does seem to be quite comprehensive, which does cover people being covered by the collective employment agreement, does ensure that there's continuity of service, and makes, importantly, the very clear distinction that these people are not new employees for the purposes of KiwiSaver, and more importantly, are not new employees for the purposes of the Employment Relations Act, because as I have said and Moana Mackie said previously, this would mean, of course, that they were subject to being able to be fired at will, without reason and without recourse to any justice. So we want to know precisely what the provisions in 59 actually do guarantee to people who work in the National Archives. I had a quick look at the State Sector Act in terms of 30E, 30F and 30G. And essentially those provisions are around issues like technical redundancy. In other words, if people are transferred, they will not have access to any sort of redundancy payment. But I would like the Minister to perhaps come to the party, give us some reassurance on that, get some advice from officials perhaps, tell us precisely what that means, and give us some confidence that employment rights for these workers are protected. Because, as I say, the people who work somewhere like in the National Archives are professional people who want to be able to do a good job and concentrate on the issue of managing our information.
I call the Honourable Guy.
Mr Chair,
Guy.
Part 3 amends the Public Records Act of 2005. In essence, it removes the Chief Executive reference to the Chief Archivist, so that therefore the Chief Archivist can focus on his or her pure role of getting on with the job and the function, which is vitally important. Now, we've heard a lot this afternoon about what occurred in the 1990s. I think moving forward, Parliament has addressed that with the 2005 Public Records Act, which was supported by the National Party. And in essence now, if you think about the 2005 Act, which is focusing on the auditing of practice and the independent external parties that the Chief Archivist has to have come in and have a look at his or her performance. Also, the results of the audit get tabled into Parliament, which is another important point of scrutiny. So this goes on and further strengthens, and it's confirmed the independence of the Chief Archivist as confirmed by the Crown Law opinion. And there are 3 reports that come to that are available to the public as a result. The Chief Archivist has the state record keeping of the public officers, first point. The second one is there's the report of the audits. The third point is the Archives Council. Those 3 reports are all going to be available to the public. In essence, this whole part of this bill, Part 3, the crux of this is covered in Section 12 on page 20. And in essence it says, and I think it's pretty clear here for those that are listening and even the opposition, that the Chief Archivist must act independently in exercising his or her professional judgment and is not subject to the direction from either the Minister or the Chief Executive. So the House should be very reassured by that very important point. So it's been further strengthened by those that have been involved as part of the Select Committee process, and I need to acknowledge those that have been involved in this process. The other important point to make on this particular point is when you have a look at around the world where Chief Archivists actually operate, I just want to give the House some examples. I think it's important. In Australia, because they all have statutory independence. So in Australia, the Chief Archivist sits within the Prime Minister and Cabinet. In Sweden, the Chief Archivist operates under the Ministry of Culture. In the UK, the Chief Archivist operates out of the Ministry of Justice. In Ireland, the Chief Archivist operates out of Arts, Sport and Tourism. And in Canada, it sits within the Canadian Heritage Portfolio. All operate with statutory independence. The other thing that I wish to mention, the importance of this whole focus, part of it is around digitisation and getting more information online, is the 12.6 million over 4 years that's going to help to store, preserve and give access of important public records to all New Zealanders. I think the other significant point is that a recent survey concludes with local governments up and down the country that half of the information that they have in their records is not now in a form that they can reuse. So that's the important point. We've got to move forward on this, still allow the Chief Archivist to have the statutory independence, and I think this is a very important part of this bill is covered under Section 12.
I call